another in a series of videos on how to make inexpensive models for museum dioramas and displays for small museums or schools that maybe don't have a budget to buy specialized models or to hire design firms. And this episode will be about how I built an orthoconic nautiloid for an Ordovician diorama. And so the materials that you'll need, and this model is about, I would say about a little over 2 feet long. And the materials that I used, well, you can use either styrofoam or you can use aluminum foil. That will become clear as to what that means in a minute. Masking tape, stiff wire. I used rolls of electric fencing wire, a 2-part epoxy putty. I use a product called Paleosculpt, which it's like 2 different types of clay type material that you knead together and then it hardens on its own, although there are types of putties that are softer and maybe a little easier to sculpt that harden by 15 minutes of baking. Then Bondo, which is an automotive repair filler for coarse applications. And then for fine filling, I use the Bondo glazing putty. Sandpaper, spray primer, spray paint. I used, I think, 3 different colors in this example. A stiff, relatively thick paper. I used actually a herbarium sheet, but construction paper might work, or manila type, folder type paper, something of that thickness that you can use an X-Acto knife to carve out patterns. An X-Acto knife, cheap acrylic paints, the kind that you get at the Walmart for less than $1 a bottle, and then small paint brushes. So the main thing you want to do is you want to use cheap resources to make up the bulk of the model. Now, in this case, I had some scrap styrofoam insulating board that I cut into the shape of a wedge, basically, to the length of the cone or the shell of the orthoconic nautiloid, and then rounded it off to make it like a cone, and then taped it with, or I wrapped it first with, I think I wrapped it first with aluminum foil and then taped it, but maybe not. Maybe just done. I think maybe I just wrapped it in masking tape. But at any rate, you could make this out of crumpled aluminum foil. The main thing you're doing is just to try to fill in the bulk of the volume with something relatively cheap. You don't want to make the whole thing out of expensive clay or Paleosculpt. And then I took lengths of wire, actually longer than I wanted the tentacles to be, just to give me some length to work with. You can always trim them later. I poked some electric fencing wire into the anterior end of the cone, as you can see here. And those will be the basis for making the arms or tentacles of the orthoconic nautiloid. At that point, I began adding the epoxy. And so this is the stuff that I use. It's a little more expensive. You might be able to get a cheaper material, but you take equal portions of this, and it's sort of like clay, and you knead them together so that ultimately they react and harden over time. It takes you generally want it to harden for about 24 hours before you continue working, which is one negative aspect of this. I guess if you use the type that you bake, it only takes 15 minutes to bake and then you can start working again. But there's only so far you can go with this before it dries, before you start messing up. As you work, you start messing up as you're handling it, the stuff that you've already done. So you kind of work in phases and let it dry and then work some more. But you can see I've started to form the head around the thing, and put the material around the bases of what are going to be the tentacles or arms, so that it stabilizes those so they don't pull out. So I basically just made the base of the arms or tentacles, and then I let that solidify. And notice also I made an eye socket for the thing. That's going to make the eye look a lot more realistic rather than just probably carving it would. So I later made a sphere out of the material after this had dried, and put that in there, and it makes it look a little bit more realistic maybe than what you could achieve very easily by carving. So now you can see kind of where I'm at. I let that dry, and then slowly started to build up the arms. And I work from the center arms first, because I can bend the wires out on the outer areas to get out of the way while I'm adding material to the arms. And so what was I going to say about building the arms? Just basically wrapping the material around there. It's tough to get it perfectly rounded and smooth. You can go back in with a Dremel tool later and kind of round those off and make them a little bit more terete. And then I've added the feature on the head here, and you can see I've added the eyes. And I was going to say the number of arms. I'm not sure that we know exactly. We can't necessarily assume that they're like a squid with 8 arms and 2 tentacles, because when we look at the only living representative of a nautiloid, the species of Nautilus, they have many arms. And so I ended up with, we don't know exactly how many they had, but I ended up putting on 16 of them, twice as many as a squid or something like that, but not as many probably as a modern Nautilus would have. And then, so I've got the head largely the way I want it to look. Now I'm starting to add a thin layer, because this stuff gets really hard. And I'm wanting to even out the cone so it's more conical, so that any dents or anything like that, I'm filling in by rolling strips of this stuff, and then applying it to the cone core there. And so here you can see that the material has been added to the cone, and it's quite raw and bumpy, but we're going to take care of that with the body filler. Notice also, again, you got whatever organism you're building, you have to look up, understand the anatomy and so on. These organisms had a structure called a hyponome, which is a part of the mantle that is used to expel water for jet propulsion. So these things, we don't know if they could spin these around so that they could move forward with them. I suspect not. So these things largely moved in reverse. They moved towards the posterior end when they moved, unless they crawled or something with their tentacles. But now you have the basic model built with its arms or tentacles, its hyponome in its shell. So now I began to apply the Bondo. This is relatively thick, and the reason I do this is it's a little easier to, I think it's a lot easier to sand than the Paleo Sculpt. But it's a coarse material, so I apply that, again, filling in more dents and kind of trying to get it more and more evenly conical. And then that is sanded. And even after you sand it, you're going to find places that you miss. You're going to have little divots and dimples in there. And that's when I go in with applying the glazing putty, which Bondo also makes. Bondo is a brand, which is even easier to sand and much finer, less coarse material that's easy to apply with I usually actually use my finger, but you could, I suppose, use some kind of a putty knife. But I apply that in a thin layer over the whole thing, making sure to fill in any divots and that kind of thing, and then sand that. And you might have to apply, after you apply the first coat and you sand it, you may have to do some spot treatments where there are little air bubbles or divots and things until you get it perfectly smooth. And so this is kind of what it looks like when it's all sanded and smoothed out. And applied a, I've applied primer paint to it. And I've also decided that, you know, the length of my tentacles, and so I've cut off the excess um, wire there. So now you have basically your completed model that's ready for painting. Now, when it comes to color pattern for these things, a lot of the species, there is actual fossil evidence for the pattern on the shell. I don't know that we know the color, the exact color, but the value. So did it have stripes or chevrons and things like that? Many of them had longitudinal thin stripes on the dorsal side, maybe even in other places. Many of them have chevron-like stripes that were perpendicular to the long axis. And so I chose a chevron style marking. And I wanted that to be, rather than trying to hand paint that on with a brush, which is going to look really uneven, I decided to use a pattern, um, a stencil basically. And so I got a piece of paper that was about the length of the shell. This is that thicker paper that we were talking about, like construction paper, but maybe a little better than construction paper. And I got the width here so that the extent of the horizontal chevrons would, their maximum extent would reach down along the side of the shell. So this you'd lay on top of your model, and as you bend it over, the the tips of the chevrons would reach the side, but not all the way around. And then so that was my maximum width. Then I determined the center line of that and drew a line down the center. And then I drew lines for the margins that follow the contours of the shell so that those chevrons would reach about the middle or just above middle on the sides of the model. And, uh, and then I put some other guidelines in there that would correspond to the angles on the nature of the chevron I have here. And I drew my chevrons in, and then completed that, and then started to take an X-Acto knife and cut them out. And then I used good quality masking tape. You don't want it to, oh, and by the way, before I applied this, I painted the shell ivory colored. That's my base color for it. So I painted the thing ivory over the primer. And then I used a high quality masking tape, something that's not going to rip off the paint when you take it off, and applied my stencil over the shell and began to paint. Now, it's going to look a little bit more realistic if you don't use just one color. Usually, you know, these things will have different values and shades on them. And so I use sort of an airbrush technique, but not with an airbrush tool, rather just with the simple spray can. And so I started with a sort of a dark brown, you know, just kind of misting, letting, you know, at a distance straight above, and letting those particles of paint fall on it. And so you just do light mistings. You don't just press down on the button and go at it. You just kind of tap the button and let it mist down on there. And I started with sort of a dark brown, especially on the extreme dorsal surface. And then I got this brick color and started to mist that in along the sides so that it graded from a sort of a brownish to a brick color. And this is the final product. You can see how it's darker brown up here, and then it slowly fades into the sort of brick color. Now it's time to work on painting the head. And in this I use satin because this is shell material and it's going to have some glare. But the body of the thing may not be so glossy. So I use matte paints. I use this Apple Barrel brand that you can get at the Walmart for less than $1 a bottle. And I'm again using the modern Nautilus as somewhat of a modern analog. And in that case, the soft parts have a base color similar to that of the shell. And so with the exception of this portion here on the head of the thing, which I made a little darker because I suspect that some of this patterning on the shell and on this part of the dorsal part of the head probably was to help with camouflage from things from above, or can confuse predators from above potentially. So I had this colored, and I used kind of a caramelish colored brown. And then notice I spritzed a little bit of the brick color, the same color I used here, kind of airbrushed a little bit of that color on the top, so it graded in from that to the caramel colored brown. And then added white spots carefully with paintbrush after this background color had dried. And then for the rest of the body, it was a slightly darker color of ivory, not exactly the same color as the shell, but I painted that on with brush. And then I used a stippling brush and dipped it into a darker brown and just kind of tapped that on the dorsal side of the tentacles. And so this may be actually the hardest part of the build, because you do have to have some, I suppose, artistic experience with regard to grading colors and painting, but there really isn't that much to it. If you can paint a wall, you can pick out that brown color and get your background. If you have some control over a spray can, you can kind of airbrush a little bit of a gradient of the brick color there. And if you can kind of dry brush, stick a stippling brush or dry brush into some paint and carefully dab it on there without globbing it on, that's all there really is to it. And so now I'll show you a video so you can get an idea of the three-dimensional aspects of it and the size of it, of the final product.